Who is Josh Mcdowell? If you are an evangelical Christian anywhere near as old as I am, this is a familiar name to you. If you are younger, then I won't be surprised to see that you have a passing familiarity with this guy through hundreds of hours of McDowell's talks on YouTube, Vimeo, or any number of other internet audio and video streaming platforms. McDowell is probably best known for his publication of two books, widely regarded as among the most popular Christian books of the 20th century. Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Historical Evidences for the Christian Faith from 1972, and More Than a Carpenter from 1977. In fact, Evidence That Demands a Verdict was named by the landmark periodical Christianity Today in 2006 as one of the top 50 most influential evangelical books since World War II. It has seen hundreds of printings, has sold millions of copies, and has been revised and extensively updated 5 times. The most recent edition, published in 2017, is 880 pages and was co-written by McDowell's son, Sean McDowell, an assistant professor in the Christian Apologetics program at Biola University and an increasingly visible social media presence. The junior McDowell claimed on his own website in 2018 that the book was named by World Magazine one of the top 40 books of the 20th century. The list published by World Magazine appeared in 1999, and while Evidence That Demands a Verdict was not in the top 40, it was ranked among the top 100 books of the 20th century. So, without quibbling too much, this is clearly an enormously popular Christian literary classic, and Josh McDowell is a giant in the realm of Christian apologetics. While I have known about McDowell for virtually my entire life, he re-entered my orbit only recently, and in an unexpected way. You see, I started college in 1994 with designs on going into Christian ministry. Maybe I would be a pastor or go to work in a youth organization like McDowell's Campus Crusade for Christ, otherwise known as crew.org. But over time, things changed. I developed a deep fascination with the biblical text and history, and with the languages, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. I went on to graduate school and then earned my PhD and became a specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Jewish manuscripts. I'm Kipp Davis, and I'm here to explore the lore of Josh McDowell. Over the years of my academic journey, McDowell had faded into the background, but then his apologetic intersected my own work on modern forgeries of Dead Sea Scrolls and private collections, those mostly owned by evangelical institutions such as Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and Museum of the Bible. In 2014, I was made aware of a video lecture by McDowell that was making the rounds in scholarly circles, and not for contributions to fields with interests in material culture and scribal practices, but rather because of the destructive, honestly shocking, cavalier handling of ancient artifacts this Christian apologist promoted as part of his own confessional agenda. For some time now, McDowell has argued very strongly for the historical reliability of the Bible and the efficacy of Christianity from the numbers of ancient manuscript copies of biblical texts. He is famous for performing what he calls a bibliographical test of the manuscript evidence, which he describes like this.
The bibliographical test. Now, what does that mean? That's a big word. It refers to the manuscripts. Now, what's a manuscript? Most people say the original copy. No, it's a handwritten document. It's that which was done by hand is called a manuscript. Manuscript. Manuscripts came before the introduction of the printing press in the 1500s, where before then everything had to be done by hand. Now, can you imagine copying the Old Testament? Come on, there's 1,000,000 consonants. Now, don't take your afternoon and count them. Just trust me. There's 1,000,000 consonants. Can you imagine how long it would take you to count them, let alone copy them? Can you imagine how many mistakes you would make? Just normal mistakes. So here you have the original. Now the original of any book manuscript is called the autographa. Autographa. Now, two things will lead to being copied. One, they need more copies. One is not enough for the world. So maybe they make 30 copies, generation number one. Or it starts to deteriorate. The ink starts to fade. So they want an accurate copy, so they make maybe 40, 50 copies. And then they take these copies and they make copies from them, generation number 2, 3, 4, ad infinitum. So they ask two questions of the manuscripts. To answer the questions, is what we have what was written down? Or has it been changed? That's the first question that relates to the manuscripts. And so the first question they ask of the manuscripts of any piece of literature of history, not just the Bible, is, what is the timeline? You say, what do you mean, what is the timeline? Well, what is the distance from the original, the autographa, how far is removed the first copy you have? You see, the rule of thumb historically is the closer the copy to the original, the greater the accuracy. Because the further away normally means, not always, is that there's been many copying done in between. Then the second question of the bibliographical test that asks about the manuscripts to see if what we have is what was written down is the number of manuscripts. How many manuscripts do you have? You see, the rule of thumb is the more manuscripts you have, the easier it is to reconstruct the original and check out any errors or discrepancies. For example, if you have 20 manuscripts, it's pretty hard to determine what the original, the autographa was, to get the exact wording and everything. But if you have 400 manuscripts, it's easy. There's certain steps you take to create what you call a pure text, a percentage of a pure text.
Now, anyone with even a moderately serious interest in the enterprise of ancient history will recognize McDowell's rambling stream of consciousness definition of the bibliographical test essentially as nonsense. But then, McDowell goes on to brag about a tsunami of new manuscript evidence that he has had a hand in discovering, acquiring, and deciphering, which tremendously bolsters his confidence as a result in the reliability of the New Testament text.
Now, how is some of this coming about? There's many different ways, but one is in Central Middle Egypt. They did not embalm the bodies like they did in Cairo and Luxor and Alexandria. What they did, they ceremonially buried them. So they created these ceremonial masks, big, thick things about this thick. Well, here, this is the first time I could show this publicly. Here's those masks. In that mask are manuscripts. You say, what? Oh yeah, classical, biblical, Old Testament, New Testament. They would make these masks. You could almost say it's papyrus shade. It's paper mache done with papyrus. And they would do 4 manuscripts and then a layer of silk, and then 4 manuscripts, a layer of silk. Now here's how you know the dating for one. These masks were only done from 150 BC to 125 AD. So you realize any manuscripts in there are the oldest ever seen by human eyes. It was in here that we discovered Mark, the oldest ever, back to the 1st century. Before then, it was 120 to 142 with the John Ryland papyri. Now, what you do, you take this mask. Oh, scholars die when they hear it, but we own them, so you can do it. You take these manuscripts, we soak them in water. We put it down into water at a certain temperature, and you can only use palmolive soap. The rest will start to destroy the manuscripts. Palmolive soap won't. You start massaging it for about 30, 40 minutes. You'll pull it up, wring it out, literally wring it out. These are worth millions. And then you put it back in for about 30, 40 minutes. But that's all papyrus manuscript, folks. And you start pulling it apart. Most scholars have never touched a manuscript. You have to have gloves on anything. We just wash them and hold them in our hands. We don't even make you wash your hands before. See my hand up in the right hand? That's a pair of tweezers. And you take those tweezers and you start pulling the layers of manuscripts off. I was so scared the first time I did it. What if you tear it? They say, well, you tear it. Since we own it, it's okay. I'm down, and we had 3 classical scholars brought in because I'm not a classical scholar. And they were to help me to understand what we were doing. So we soaked in water this for a while and started peeling it off. That there is the oldest copy of the book of Romans by 125 years ever discovered. The top scholar in the world was in my office the other day, and he brought in some new discoveries we're looking at, and we're going to be doing 2 more of these Mass, December 5th and 6th. And he said, Josh, I hate to say this to you, but in the last Mass, we broke your record. We took it back another 25 years, the book of Romans. And then I'm doing this, and I come across this one, and I thought, boy, it was really clear, well done. And there were numbers between the 2 lines down here. And I called one of the scholars, I said, I'm not quite sure what this means. He said, you have just uncovered the first ever book 1, page 1 of the Iliad by Homer. And those 2 numbers, the first number said what book it was, and the second set of numbers, what page. This is incredible. 17 in 6 hours uncovered. These are just biblical manuscripts, and many other 30-some total manuscripts of the Iliad and Homer. Last night, I worked on a chapter I'm doing on this for a book on Islam, on the scripture. And I finally had to take every single stat on every classical, every biblical manuscript, put an asterisk by it, and put down below. By the time you read this, it is outdated. With a tsunami of evidence being discovered every day. In just the last few months, 150 major discoveries.
The technique McDowell describes for mining manuscript fragments from an ancient funerary mask is called dismounting, and it has been condemned by experts for decades, in large part because of the ethically dubious practice of one culture destroying another culture's historical treasures for their own purposes. It was under this pretense that McDowell also promotes the looting and private sale of non-provenance antiquities, on-site identification, and ad hoc analysis of manuscripts. There has been no shortage of criticism of McDowell for this lecture. Bryce C. Jones wrote a scathing critique in his blog, and Roberta Mazza, a renowned papyrologist at my alma mater, the University of Manchester, embarked on a written campaign against the illicit marketing and trafficking of ancient manuscripts that implicated McDowell and his ilk. However, at the time I first watched this video, my attention was drawn to something else. Near the beginning of his talk, McDowell reflects back on his own personal history and how the manuscript tradition of the New Testament was influential on his own conversion to Christianity.
My whole background is, as a result of some experiences at Kellogg College in my home life and everything, I set out to write New Evidence in Man's Verdict against Christianity. I set out, traveled throughout the United States, England, Germany, France, Switzerland, Middle East, gathering the evidence to write Evidence that Demands a Verdict. I'd returned to London, England. It was a Friday night, about 6:30, in a small museum library. I was examining some manuscripts, and I leaned back in my chair in front of everyone. I just said, it's true. It's true. It's true. And that started in me quite an intense journey to reverse everything I desired in life. And since then, I've not spent one day that I haven't researched.
In particular, McDowell claims that his conversion as a 19-year-old college freshman came about as a result of examining some manuscripts in a small museum library in London. McDowell's personal conversion story has for a long time been an integral component of his apologetic style, and it is part of an all too common trope. The hardened skeptic coming to faith through his own kiboshed efforts to refute religious claims. McDowell himself even applies the trope to others. He has on occasion described the great 18th century jurist Simon Greenleaf as...
He was a skeptic.
He wasn't.
Often mocking the Christians in his classes.
He didn't. In his case, McDowell has frequently spoken and written about an upbringing in an abusive household as a source of bitterness when he was a young man attending college, and how an encounter with students who challenged him to examine the evidence for the claims of the New Testament came to convince him of its veracity. I was taken aback by what I heard in this talk because this bit about manuscript hunting and study was new. When I was a PhD student, I worked as a teaching assistant for an apologetics professor at a small Christian university in my area, and he had a first edition copy of McDowell's magnum opus on his bookshelf. The short story that McDowell told in this video rang true, but unsettlingly at odds with what I had remembered from the testimony he included in his 630-word essay at the end of his 1972 classic book under the title, I've Got a Satisfied Mind. This is how he describes his time as a freshman at Kellogg College.
I decided that education must be the answer. Since all of our leaders are educated, I went to a university and talked with students about problems, but we didn't have any solutions. And although my professors could tell me how to make a better living, they couldn't tell me how to live better. But about that time, I saw some students and a few professors who had a different dimension about them. They seemed to be riding above their circumstances, not under a pile. So after a while, I asked them very simply, what has changed your lives? A young lady looked up at me, smiled, and said 2 words, Jesus Christ. These students pointed out to me that Christianity was not a religion, but a relationship. Then you know what happened? They challenged me to intellectually examine the claims of Jesus as the Son of God. Boy, I thought I was a farce. But these people continually challenged me, so I accepted their challenge. As a result, I found historical facts and evidence about Jesus Christ that I never knew existed. I used to listen to professors in supercilious humanities classes, and if they didn't believe Christianity, you weren't going to catch me believing it. But I found that I was rejecting Christ on their biases and ignorance.
McDowell's description of his rigorous investigation comprises all of 2 sentences.
I accepted their challenge. As a result, I found historical facts and evidence about Jesus Christ that I never knew existed.
Missing is any mention of his extensive travels, of the small museum library in London, of his fascination with and examination of manuscripts. So this prompted me to look more closely at what he was asserting. I eventually found myself watching hours of video recounting his conversion story. Here's McDowell telling what happened in 2008.
And so I accepted their challenge, and I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it to refute them. In fact, the background of my first book that I'm really known for in most places around the world, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. The whole background of that huge book was to write a book against Christianity, to show us intellectually stupid and to refute these students and professors. I left the university, traveled throughout the United States, England, Germany, France, and the Middle East, gathering the evidence to write Evidence That Demands a Verdict against those students and professors and to refute Christianity. And I was sitting in a small museum library in London, England. I'm going to try to find this library when I go back there in a couple weeks. It was a Friday night about 6:30. I remember I was quite tired, and I leaned back in my chair, and I cupped my hands behind my head. And right in front of everyone, which probably was 3 people, I said, "It's true! It's true! It's true!" Now, what I meant by that was a reference to the New Testament. What I had concluded as an antagonistic, obnoxious, agnostic university student. Now, that's a mouthful. But that's probably the best way to describe my attitude at that time. What I meant by that was I had concluded as a total non-believer that there were 2 things true about the New Testament. One, that what I held in my hand as a New Testament is literally what was written down 2,000 years ago. It has not been changed. Don't you let anyone come along and tell you that the Christians came along and changed it. That's historically incorrect. And I believe in Evidence That Demands a Verdict, new evidence now, it's called the New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I believe in there I document that I could reproduce the New Testament to a 99.5% pure text. Second thing I concluded was not only that what I had was what was written down, but this was more important, that what was written down was true. Because my mother didn't raise any dummies. If what was written down wasn't true, then I could care less that what I have today is what was written down. Come on, I'm not stupid.
Here he is telling the same story several years later in 2013.
I said, okay, I'll accept your challenge, but I didn't do it to prove anything. I wrote the whole background of my first book. That's that big gold one right there. To write that book was to set out to write a book against Christianity, to make a joke of those Christians on campus. I figured that'd be easy to do. I left the university. I traveled throughout the United States, England, Germany, France, and Switzerland, gathering the evidence to write this book. And I'd returned to London, England. It was about 6:30 on a Friday night in a small museum library. And I remember I leaned back in my chair and right in front of everyone, which was probably 3 people, I said, "It's true. It's true. It's true." Now, what I meant by that was a reference to the New Testament. What I had concluded as an obnoxious, antagonistic, angry, ornery university student, I had concluded intellectually I could hold the New Testament in my hand, and I made 2 conclusions about it. One, that what I have is what was written down has not been changed. But second, I concluded that what was written down was true.
And again, in spectacular high definition in 2018.
I said, look, I'm not going to do it to prove anything. I'm going to do it to refute you. In fact, the whole background of this great, big, huge book right here, the whole background was to write a book against these Christians and destroy their faith in God. And I figured that'd be easy. Any fool could do that. And so I left the university. And so I had quite a bit of money, a lot of money for that day. And so I took off. I traveled throughout the United States, England, Germany, France, Switzerland, and the Middle East to gather the evidence to write that book, to intellectually make a joke of those Christian students and professors. I was returning home, and I had an overnight in London. And so I went in late afternoon, after I got in, I went to the small museum library, because they were very famous, it was at that time, for manuscripts and scrolls that I wanted to check out of the Bible. And I remember sitting there, and I leaned back in my chair, and I cupped my hands behind my head, and right in front of everyone, which was probably 3 people. It was a very small museum, trust me. I said, "It's true. It's true. It's true." And what I meant by that is an obnoxious, angry, ornery, abhorrent, agnostic university student, I concluded intellectually that I could hold, starting with the New Testament in my hands, and have confidence what I have is what was written down, and what was written down is what I have.
Here he is, telling the story in Spanish.
But I said, I'm not going to do it to prove anything.
Pero yo les dije, yo no lo voy a hacer para probar algo.
I'm going to do it to refute you.
Yo lo voy a hacer para refutarlos.
The whole background of that big book out there, Evidencia que demanda un veredicto. La razón para escribir ese libro was para destruir la fe cristiana, con documentación y los hechos y evidencia. So yo salí a la universidad, viajando y investigaciones en los Estados Unidos, Inglaterra, Alemania, Francia, Suiza y Medio Oeste, para conseguir la evidencia para destruir la fe de los profesores y estudiantes. Cuando estaba volviendo,
Volviendo.
una noche en London,
En Londres.
me fui a un museo pequeño que fue muy famoso por los manuscritos y rollos cristianos bíblicos. Yo estaba sentado allá, enfrente de todo, 3 personas, Yo dije con mucha fuerte, es la verdad. Es la verdad. Es la verdad.
In February of this year, McDowell provided some clarification to this museum library episode that had not appeared in any of the earlier versions of this story.
I'd heard about this small museum that had this library known for its biblical manuscripts and scrolls. Because you see, one of the things I knew, if I could show that the biblical manuscripts and the scrolls were not reliable or accurate, my case was won, because everything they teach and everything's based on it. So I figured that ought to be easy. So I went there, interacted with some of the professors and all that came there. I interacted with the head of the museum. They explained different things to me.
In his 2018 talk, he provided new details to quash any lingering incredulity about a globe-trotting teenager in 1958. Or was that the 1960s?
I left the university, traveled. Now, the only reason I could do that is I'd made a lot of money. My dad at least taught me one good thing: if you can't find a job, create one. So I've never in my life been 1 minute without a job. And so I created a painting company. It was in the 60s when the recession, the economy just went to pits. No students, students were dropping out of school, there was no money. And so I started a painting company. I hired them, and I made about quite a bit of money off every hour they worked. And it was called Superior Painting Company, and then I sold it. And so I had quite a bit of money, a lot of money.
Anyone who watches even this small sampling from nearly a dozen talks can see that McDowell has crafted a fairly precise narrative about his experience, not just in terms of the events he describes, but also in their arrangement and construction. He uses the same anecdotes in the same places. A refutation of the challenge issued by his friends and professors would be easy, and the data he ended up collecting formed the core of his first book. There were only 3 people in the small museum library. His epiphany there was made as an obnoxious, angry, ornery university student. His conclusions were made about a New Testament that he could hold in his hand, the recollection of specific dates and times, about 6:30 on a Friday. This is pretty obviously a programmatic narrative, intended to drive home and anticipate a response from his audience. And such things are not altogether that different when it comes to interrogating the provenance of ancient manuscripts. Associate Professor of Religious Studies and the Director of the Jewish Studies program at UC Davis, Eva Morochek, made this point in a thoughtful essay written a few years ago about origin stories that have accompanied valuable artifacts for centuries.
Considering the metaphorical resonance of a fictional discovery story alerts us to how our own real narratives of origins reveal patterns in how we think about the discovery of the ancient past. At first glance, origin stories seem to have 2 purposes. First, scholars use discovery stories to recount the provenance of texts, to trace their chain of custody, and also to authorize their authenticity. A newly surfaced manuscript or artifact is called unprovenanced when it is not found in situ, that is, in the place of its ancient deposition, by professional archaeologists, and has no other traceable origin story. The fact that an artifact is unprovenanced automatically places into doubt both its authenticity, could it be a forgery, and brings to the fore ethical questions relating to how it was found, purchased, and removed from its country of origin. Second, the origin story becomes the introduction or frame for how we talk about our ancient sources. Each time we tell the story of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi codices, we retell a version of how the past has made it into the present. We do this both because such stories are enchanting and entertaining, and because they contextualize the ancient materials in our own time. So in one sense, these stories are paratexts. They provide context for our sources, written and retold for those sources' sake.
In a way, McDowell's own conversion story is itself a type of discovery narrative, a paratext that functions both to entertain his audience and to contextualize his experience. But I think it is significant that he clearly wants this experience to map onto the importance that he has set on ancient manuscripts as an apologetic device for effecting Christian conversion. In a sense, McDowell is writing himself into his own version of the bibliographical test. I scoured the internet for older presentations of McDowell's origin story in an effort to track how it has developed over the last 6 decades that he's been in public ministry. Unfortunately, there was little to be found beyond the first video from 2008 that was produced by his own organization. But then, what about the postscript to his first book where this story first appeared? Evidence That Demands a Verdict has been a bestseller for years and has been revised and updated multiple times. When I first embarked on this project, I began consulting printed sources for McDowell's story. It appears in every edition of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, all the way up to the most recent publication in 2017. Not only that, but his story is also included in his second book, More Than a Carpenter, from 1977, as well as in a free booklet he wrote in 1989 titled Skeptics Who Demanded a Verdict, where he included his own among a collection of conversion stories featuring 2 other renowned former skeptics, Chuck Colson and C.S. Lewis. So, thinking back to that first telling of the story in which McDowell found historical facts and evidence about Jesus Christ that he never knew existed, here is how he recounted the same event 5 years later in More Than a Carpenter.
My new friends challenged me intellectually to examine the claim that Jesus Christ is God's Son. I thought it was a farce, but these people challenged me over and over. Finally, I accepted their challenge, but I did it out of pride to refute them. But I didn't know there were facts. I didn't know there was evidence that a person could evaluate. Finally, my mind came to the conclusion that Jesus Christ must have been who he claimed to be. In fact, the background of my first 2 books was my setting out to refute Christianity. When I couldn't, I ended up becoming a Christian. I have now spent 13 years documenting why I believe faith in Jesus Christ is intellectually feasible.
So, what's different here? By 1977, McDowell claims that the background to his first book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, was grounded in his research on the topic as a college freshman. In 2006, the San Antonio Christian Beacon published a brief biographical sketch of McDowell in which he says that this project was a paper that would examine the historical evidence of the Christian faith in order to disprove it. Here's how McDowell told the story in his 1989 booklet.
It wasn't long before these new friends challenged me intellectually to examine the claim that Jesus Christ is God's Son. At first, I thought this was a joke. How ridiculous. I knew answers to any argument a Christian could bring up, but these people kept challenging me over and over and over again. Finally, I accepted their challenge, but I did it out of pride to refute them. But I didn't know there were facts. I didn't know there was evidence that a person could evaluate. In fact, the background of my first book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, was done to enable me to write a book that would make an intellectual joke of their kinds of beliefs. So I set out and spent a lot of money to make an intellectual joke of Christianity, but after 2 years, it backfired on me. I came to the conclusion that Christ had to be who he claimed to be. Finally, after gathering the evidence, I was forced to conclude that my arguments against Christianity wouldn't stand up.
In this version, McDowell has expanded the time parameters of his search to 2 years and says it cost him a lot of money. This written version of McDowell's story closely aligns with the one he told in a 1981 formal debate.
Intelligent people make up your mind. The background for the points I'm going to make is that when I was in the university, I wanted to write a book against Christianity. I wanted to refute it intellectually. The last thing I wanted to do was become a Christian. But after 2 years of research and spending a lot of money and time, I discovered certain facts that are documented in sources in history.
For over 25 years, Evidence That Demands a Verdict was published by McDowell's employer, Campus Crusade for Christ. And as far as I know, all of the revenue generated from the sales of the book were returned directly to the ministry. Then, In 1999, McDowell parted company with Here's Life Publishers. This is the publishing arm of Crew. And he produced the first major revision of the book, but this time with the publishing giant Thomas Nelson. And now under the title, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Here is how the same story appeared after 27 years in this newly updated volume.
Then my new friends issued me a challenge I couldn't believe. They challenged me, a pre-law student, to examine intellectually the claim that Jesus Christ is God's Son. I thought this was a joke. These Christians were so dumb. How could something as flimsy as Christianity stand up to an intellectual examination? I scoffed at their challenge, but they didn't let up. They continued to challenge me day after day, and finally they backed me into a corner. I became so irritated at their insistence that I finally accepted their challenge, not to prove anything, but to refute them. I decided to write a book that would make an intellectual joke of Christianity. I left the university and traveled throughout the United States and Europe to gather evidence to prove that Christianity is a sham.
This is the first time McDowell mentions anything about traveling throughout the United States and abroad in his quest for evidence. This is also where McDowell first says anything about an epiphany in a Northeast London museum library.
One day while I was sitting in the library in London, England, I sensed a voice within me saying, "Josh, you don't have a leg to stand on." I immediately suppressed it, but just about every day after that, I heard the same inner voice. The more I researched, the more I heard this voice. I returned to the United States and to the university, but I couldn't sleep at night.
Up to this point in time, McDowell has expanded on his own personal quest for the historical Jesus, from a college paper to forming the background of his first books to becoming a book project in its own right that comprised 2 years of research and featured extensive intercontinental travel. While every version of this story continues to be amplified and greatly elaborated, before 2000 there was still no mention of the role that ancient manuscripts played in McDowell's studies. In 2017, Evidence That Demands a Verdict was once again substantially revised and updated, and for the first time, co-authored by his son Sean. The story of McDowell's conversion appeared once again in the introduction to the book.
Then my new friends issued me a challenge I couldn't believe. They challenged me, a pre-law student, to make a rigorous intellectual examination of the claims of Jesus Christ. I thought this challenge was a joke. These Christians were so dumb. How could something as flimsy as Christianity stand up to an intellectual examination? I scoffed at their challenge, but they didn't let up. They continued to challenge me day after day, and finally they backed me into the corner. I became so irritated at their insistence that I finally accepted their challenge, just to prove them wrong. I decided to write a book that would show them that Christianity was a joke, intellectually and historically. I left for college for a period of months so that I could travel throughout the United States and Europe to gather evidence in libraries and museums to prove that Christianity is a sham. At the end of my journey in Europe, I found myself sitting in a museum library in London, England. After several hours of research studying some out-of-print books, I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my eyes, and without remembering I was in a quiet library, I spoke out loud, "It's true! It's true! It's really true!" It was 6:30 p.m. when I left the library, but it seemed that there was a voice within me saying, "Josh, you don't have a leg to stand on." I immediately suppressed it, but just about every day after that, I heard the same inner voice. The more I researched, the more it just got louder and louder. The more I researched, the more I became aware of the same challenge. I returned to the United States and continued my research at the Harvard University and the University of Michigan libraries, but I couldn't sleep at night.
Again, there are no manuscripts in this story. But where in his public talk McDowell speaks of this small London library being famous for biblical or Christian manuscripts and scrolls, here he is at the library reading some out-of-print books. That's different. And I wonder if the recent history of biblical manuscript finds and transactions has something to do with this. You see, as far back as the late 90s, a Norwegian manuscript collector named Martin Skoyen was aggressively tracking down fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls that he could add to his already extensive collection of other impressive artifacts. By 2008, when McDowell's first public talk featuring his conversion story appeared on YouTube, there were some 25 supposed Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in private collections and circulating between exhibitions in the United States. In 2009, the Green family, owners of American craft retail giant Hobby Lobby, began buying ancient manuscripts of a wide variety, culminating over 4 years in over 40,000 artifacts that would come to form the core of the collection housed in the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. These acquisitions were made under the direction of Scott Carroll, a biblical scholar who had assembled and curated another private collection of biblical manuscripts for Robert Van Campen, and who had become notorious for his practice of dismounting Egyptian funerary masks, as described by McDowell. That same year, the private evangelical school Azusa Pacific University in Southern California purchased and exhibited 5 fragments, also supposedly from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The following year, now disgraced president of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Paige Patterson, and his wife Dorothy solicited millions of dollars from donors to acquire 8 fragments. One of these contained text from a passage in Leviticus 21 that condemns homosexuality. A representative from the seminary claimed that this was an especially expensive fragment precisely because the particular passage is a timeless truth from God's Word to the global culture today. Then, this happened.
Of course, to demand a first-century copy of Mark goes far beyond what is demanded for any other ancient literature. However, in the last few months, several very early fragments of the New Testament have been discovered. These will be published by an international scholarly publishing house in a book 1 year from now. By way of background, prior to this book, I mentioned that we knew of as many as a dozen second-century manuscripts from the New Testament that were in the 2nd century. Once the book is published, the numbers will change dramatically. As many as 18 New Testament manuscripts from the 2nd century. Among the finds was also a fragment of Luke that is from the early 2nd century. It thus rivals P52, that fragment that Bart showed you, the manuscript traditionally considered to be the oldest New Testament manuscript known to exist. And yet this new Luke fragment is not the oldest New Testament manuscript. The oldest manuscript of the New Testament is now a fragment from Mark's Gospel that is from the 1st century. How accurate is the dating? Well, my source is a papyrologist who worked on this manuscript, a man whose reputation is unimpeachable. Many consider him to be the best papyrologist on the planet. His reputation is on the line with this dating, and he knows it, but he is certain that this manuscript was from the 1st century. This papyrus fragment, just like the other new discoveries that we are preparing for publication, strongly confirms what most scholars have already said is the original text.
Professor Wallace's announcement of a 1st century copy of Mark's Gospel was a sensation. And for the next 6 years, scholars waited with an eagerness teetering on desperation for the publication of this astonishing fragment, which was believed to have been purchased by the Greens and now part of the Museum of the Bible's enormous collection. This was the same fragment that McDowell had claimed to discover in his 2013 talk. In the meantime, McDowell had been spotted at an event at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, in early 2012, where Scott Carroll was performing a dismounting to reveal a cache of ancient classical and Christian manuscripts. This particular exhibition, it turns out, was itself a hoax, at which no new discoveries were actually made. McDowell himself had entered the antiquities market and by that time had purchased a medieval Torah scroll that he used as a prop in his public talks. In 2013, he organized and hosted an event called Discover the Evidence, which featured both Carroll and Wallace and my own friend and mentor, Professor Peter Flint. Carroll dismounted McDowell's own recently acquired Egyptian funerary mask, hunting for New Testament manuscripts.
I was nervous. I mean, really nervous. It was December 6, 2013. Our ministry had organized an unprecedented event called Discover the Evidence. It brought together apologists, highly specialized scholars in ancient language, and speakers in the field of discovering, translating, and preserving ancient biblical manuscripts. Our ministry had just acquired some ancient Egyptian artifacts, and under the leadership of Dr. Scott Carroll, an ancient manuscript specialist, he was about to carefully dismantle them. Some of these artifacts were from 1500 to 2200 years old. So the hope was that hidden beneath them, we would find papyri fragments of ancient New Testament manuscripts. The moment of truth had finally arrived. Dr. Carroll was ready to announce his preliminary findings. Would God answer my prayers? Would we be allowed to obtain just one New Testament manuscript?
The text is from Galatians. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines.
God had answered my prayer. He had allowed our ministry to be the stewards of His ancient word. And when all the identification analysis was finished, God had granted us 6 ancient New Testament passages and 1 Old Testament manuscript fragment, 7 treasures in all. We have the writings of Mark 15, John 14, Matthew 6 and 7, and 1 John 2, possibly the earliest papyri passage in any language in existence today. We have a passage from Galatians 4, which appears to be one of the earliest known papyri, and the Old Testament passage is from Jeremiah 33, which is the earliest known Coptic language papyrus in existence today. They are not being placed in a museum, because I will be taking them with me when I speak. I want to personally share them with you and your kids. I want your children to know that there's reliable evidence for Christ and His Word.
In 2016, investigative journalist Ariel Sabar penned an explosive expose of the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife fragment that Harvard professor Karen King had published. A fragment that turned out to be a modern forgery. By 2017, more than a dozen of the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments from the Scoia'tael Collection and the Museum of the Bible had come under fierce scrutiny by a growing number of scholars who were convinced that they were fakes. Questions were mounting over the legitimacy of claims about the 1st century Mark fragment, which, as it turns out, was actually a 3rd century fragment in the Oxyrhynchus Papyri collection of the Egypt Exploration Society. Its editor, Dirk Obink, had unscrupulously attempted to sell it to the Museum of the Bible in November 2011. By the time McDowell wrote his newly updated testimony in the 2017 edition of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, had he decided to start downplaying the manuscript influence in his own discovery narrative. He still featured it in his public talks, but these sorts of assertions never made it to print. The especially fluid nature of McDowell's story raises all sorts of questions about its accuracy. Did he ever actually intend to write a book as a college freshman to disprove Christianity? Did he commit 2 years of research to this enterprise, if not to studying biblical manuscripts? Was this jet-set 19-year-old actually engaged in a transatlantic expedition to complete his research project? Well, I think it's abundantly clear that elements of McDowell's story are at best greatly embellished, at worst completely fabricated. The answer to these questions is not a straightforward no. I confess that I find the whole idea of a college freshman traipsing the globe in search of manuscript evidence to grind an axe against Christianity patently absurd. To say nothing of the prohibitive expense of international travel before the early 60s, I cannot for the life of me fathom what McDowell would have imagined seeing or learning from Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek manuscripts that have been the subject of intense scholarly scrutiny for generations. The layperson might envision him poring over archived documents and priceless manuscripts like a qualified academic, but in reality, this sort of Access and the wherewithal to perform such research is not at all likely possessed by a community college freshman such as McDowell. Did he circulate between museums and public library spaces like those in the Deansgate Special Collections at the University of Manchester, viewing showcased manuscripts on public display there? If so, what could he learn by seeing papyri and codices he lacks the expertise to study, to say nothing for the languages necessary to read in the first place? Moreover, while a good number of museums and university libraries maintain public access, many do not. McDowell in 2017 wrote of continuing his research at the Harvard libraries, but this would have been impossible at the time without pre-approved access and some sort of academically recognized recommendation. The idea on its own that McDowell even set foot in the Andover Harvard Library, the Houghton Library, or one of the other university library centers there as an out-of-state college undergraduate simply strains credulity. I've been in contact with the archivists at Harvard, and while all of their applications for library access from before the 60s were unfortunately lost in a fire, they were able to confirm that McDowell would certainly have needed to apply for official permission to enter the university libraries. While I think we can fairly confidently dismiss any ideas about McDowell conducting a 2-year international campaign for evidence in biblical manuscripts and scrolls, there is a kernel of truth behind this story. A biography of McDowell was published in 1981, authored by Joe Musser, titled Josh, The Excitement of the Unexpected. He provides details of McDowell's formative years in the first 45 pages up to his enrollment at Wheaton College in 1960. This is an evangelical liberal arts school that was founded by abolitionists shortly before the Civil War. Musser tells the story of McDowell's freshman year at Kellogg College in 1959 and how he was inspired by an English professor there to write a term paper critiquing the historical claims of Christianity. As he was researching, he was also challenged by a local group of students to start attending church with them in an effort to provide a more balanced approach to his project. After a few months of this, McDowell converted and began preaching in and around Detroit and Lansing, Michigan. In 1960, before his arrival at Wheaton, he caught the attention of Reverend Carl McIntyre, the founder and president of the International Council of Christian Churches. McIntyre invited McDowell to join his youth outreach program, and that summer, McDowell traveled to Europe and served as the speaker for this group. Musser writes, "The summer was a fantastic experience for Josh. He spoke in churches and in prayer groups in Great Britain and studied in Battenberg, Switzerland. During his free time, he visited British courts and talked to English barristers about their trial law." So yes, while McDowell did journey to Europe as a teenager, and while it was a formative experience for him, no, he was not there studying manuscripts and doggedly gathering evidence. So why does any of this matter anyways? Josh McDowell seems like a sweet old man who loves to interact with and teach college kids. He genuinely appears to be sincere, caring, and earnest about making a difference. So why should we care about such arguably insignificant fabrications? For all his best intentions, I think there are a few reasons. For one, I think McDowell has set the bar with his own pontifications about the importance of truth. And he has tied this to his own reputation.
Because for the first time in my life, I knew, I had been before, but now I knew I was being intellectually dishonest. And that bothered me with the emphasis that I put on truth. Because for the first time in my life, now I had been before, but this is the first time I really knew I was being intellectually dishonest. Most people who are intellectually dishonest, they don't realize it. And I didn't for years. But this time I knew I was, and I put such an emphasis on truth that it bothered me.
He wants us to take him seriously as a purveyor of truth. By McDowell's own standard, it is incumbent upon us to consider the integrity of his words and his reliability as a narrator. Furthermore, I think that the ease by which he is prone to embellish and to promote an apocryphal tale of his own history prompts us to more carefully consider not just the quality of his research, but the nature of storytelling and text transmission more generally. If McDowell harbors no qualms about fabricating his past or about the role in the acquisition and study of antiquities that he enthusiastically hawks in his talks and writings, then how reliable are the bulk of his apologetic claims? If he has managed to craft a widely disseminated ahistorical narrative about his own life within 50 years, then how does that weigh against the exceptional importance that apologists set on the value of first-hand accounts and eyewitness testimony from antiquity? Something remarkable is happening here. As more and more time passes, and as McDowell's conversion narrative becomes further removed from the events themselves, it is becoming increasingly more mystifying and projecting closer and closer to an image of himself that McDowell has crafted over time. His story actually demonstrates to us what manuscript experts have always known, that writings, all writings, are susceptible to sensationalizing, mythologizing, and change over time. But I think there is something else here that draws our attention. And that is the role that antiquities have played and continue to play as vehicles for propaganda. McDowell's story requires us all to think carefully about the stories we construct around antiquities and our motivations and goals for telling them. Moreover, and finally, it behooves us as scholars to start addressing these poisonous falsehoods in earnest, and to repudiate agenda-driven popularizations of our scholarship. I'm Kipp Davis. Thanks for watching.